I think we're just at the onset of cyber criminals figuring out how to use Gen AI to create perfect, air quotes, phishing, social engineering attacks that, technically it's not going to get picked up. 10 countries, including Canada, came together, launched a disruption action against Lockbit. So that entailed going after some of their servers, their leak site, their admin panel, seizing crypto accounts operated by some of those affiliates, and generally just disrupting their operation. We will reach out to the victim, say you need to take immediate action. We're now doing that about 500 times a year. They're able to pull the plug really early on and not lose any data, or at least if it's sort of midstream, catch it early enough that they don't have to pay a ransom.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's show. This series, Code and Country, is brought to you by Plurilock. In each episode, we will explore the critical intersection of technology, security, and the defense of democratic institutions. And today we are diving into the world of cybersecurity with one of Canada's foremost experts. Joining is Chris Lynam, Director General of the National Cybercrime Coordination Center at the RCMP.
Thanks, Ian. It's great to be here today and talk about a little bit what we're up to.
Chris, you've had a pretty interesting career, having spent time working both in law enforcement, government, and the military. Can you talk a little bit about your journey and how you got started?
Sure. I started my professional career in the military. I actually went to the Royal Military College, one of Canada's great institutions. Got my undergraduate degree there. Had a very broad range, sort of multifaceted education there. Really set me up for success later in life. Joined the government of Canada as a public servant right 2 days before 9/11. Which was a really interesting time to be part of the security intelligence apparatus of the government of Canada. Worked for a couple different departments, doing various things, then moved to the RCMP in 2013. And really the RCMP started to really figure out, like, what do we need to do more to address cybercrime? So I was part of a lot of work, policy-wise, sort of conceptual work, say, how do we tackle this beast? It then was, compared to what is now, wasn't as obviously as big a threat, and was sort of on the ground floor of, hey, we need a national coordinating body to work with our partners, law enforcement partners and others, including the private sector. And so what's that look like? And that ended up being the National Cybercrime Coordination Center, the NC3, which I now have the great honor to lead.
So what is the mission of NC3 within RCMP? I mean, like, are you the guys who are going to respond when companies get hacked and we call the police?
We're not going to be the ones who are going to typically not going to be the ones who are going to respond on site to when a company or organization gets hacked in Canada. Our mission is to work with a range of partners, so both domestic and international law enforcement partners, other government departments, private sectors, with the main effort to reduce the impact and threat of cybercrime and really reduce that level of victimization in Canada. And we specifically use the word reduce. We do that in three main ways. One, again, we work with those range of partners to pursue those cyber criminals. So that means finding who's behind the keyboard, who's behind those attacks, producing the intelligence and providing the technical expertise to help our partners move either an investigation forward to apprehend someone, or if that's not possible, to pursue them through a disruption effort. So that's the first main thing we do. The second is we do what we call interventions. So we either come across information or intelligence. We get intelligence shared from our partners, policing partners, or sometimes the private sector comes to us and they say, we're seeing an attack happen in real time or just about to happen, it's imminent. And what we will do is we will reach out to the victim, and often through our police partners, we'll do that and say, you need to take immediate action. We're now doing that about 500 times a year, and it can have a huge impact to really reduce that impact, where they either able to pull the plug really early on and not lose any data, or at least if it's sort of midstream, they know what's lost, and they're able to catch it early enough that they don't have to pay a ransom. So that's really important part of our work now. And then the third part of our work is what we call our prevent pillar. And this is where we're increasingly seeing some at-risk or young Canadians becoming cyber criminals in this country. And so what we do is we figure out ways to engage that sort of community and encourage them to take a different path. So try and divert them to a path if they're really cyber savvy individuals, to encourage them to like use their cyber skills for good. We feel, and we need to put some more resources into that, because we got to prevent people from becoming cyber criminals, so we don't have to spend a huge amount of resources at the back end investigating them and maybe disrupting them.
If I can double click there on the second part. So you said finding who's behind the keyboard, so kind of attribution. Second pillar, though, getting intelligence and trying to get left of boom. How has that evolved from your time starting at NC3 to today? Do you see a trend of being able to get left of boom more often now, or is it getting harder than when you started?
Maybe both. We are getting left of boom more. In the early days when we were doing some of those interventions, we would cold call victims out of the blue, and guess what would happen often? Like, they wouldn't take the call. Like, they would think it was a scam because they didn't know what either the RCMP or my unit or police could do in this space. A lot often now they take the call and they quickly realize that we're there to help and try and mitigate damage. But at the same time, we're seeing more attacks. The attacks are more sophisticated. So, we're doing as much as we can right now. But we keep trying to use opportunities like this to get the word out and say, hey, we've got this whole range of work that law enforcement working with other government partners can do, both on sort of, we'll investigate to try and find who's behind the keyboard, but we also might be able to help you right in the middle of the attack. And we want to stop people before they become cyber criminals as well.
So cybercrime, pretty notoriously borderless. What are some of the success stories or maybe challenges that you've faced in collaborating with international partners to combat cyber threats?
Sure, and I think you mentioned when you use the word borderless, Ian, you're right on. The scenario or the explanation we use is you will often have a lot of victims in different parts of the country, right, across Canada, and you'll have victims in other parts of the world. You'll have the perpetrators behind that they could be in Canada, or they could be in another part of the world, or they could be in both. And then you have the data or the evidence, particularly with so many people on the cloud now, in another jurisdiction. So from a law enforcement perspective, and us having to go out and get that evidence using judicial authorizations, borders pose a problem. And so really the approach we've taken is to come up with these international constructs to really tackle the problem. So we work a lot with our Five Eyes partners, but even broader that, our European partners through Europol, which is the European Union Policing Coordination Agency, very, very capable. We have 2 full-time people placed at Europol just working on cybercrime, so they can exchange in real time with their partners. And working with a whole range of other partners, including the private sector, to have this like team sport approach. And to give you a sense of a couple of examples, is one from a couple of years ago, which was in relation to the Hive ransomware group, a particularly vicious group that targeted healthcare systems, closely linked to the attack against the Newfoundland healthcare system a couple of years back. And so we worked with a bunch of international partners, and including very closely with the FBI on this. And the operation, so Hive was taken down, or their infrastructure was taken down. But what also was happening behind the scenes was the FBI had really good access to the Hive backend server. And so what the FBI decided was, when they saw an attack being spun up by Hive, they would reach out to law enforcement agencies in that country. And so for Canada, that was us. And we would in turn warn the victim. And so in real time, call the victim and say, hey, you're under attack. You need to take mitigation right now. So we did that 60 times over the course of we've warned 60 victims. But then we were actually working with the FBI, able to work out a process where they were able to get a copy of the decryption key that Hive was using, would create when they would encrypt or would want to encrypt the victim's system, and you would pay the ransom and you'd get the decryption key. FBI made a copy of those keys, and then we, through a back-end route, would, if we didn't get to the victim soon enough, would get that decryption key into the hands of the victim. They deploy it and they get their data back or their system back up and running, and they wouldn't pay the ransom. So we think we saved a lot of money, and a lot of business interruptions for those businesses by doing that. So that was the Hive. That's just a good example of both working internationally and then maybe doing something different than just putting handcuffs on people. The second was more recently Operation Kronos. So against the Lockbit group. Lockbit was the globe's greatest cybercrime ransomware entity. It operated as ransomware as a service with sort of a couple of core administrators, a gentleman known as Lockbit Sup, and then they had a whole bunch of affiliates. So in February of this year, 10 countries, including Canada, came together and launched a disruption action against Lockbit. So that entailed going after some of their servers, their leak site, their admin panel, seizing crypto accounts operated by some of those affiliates, and generally just disrupting their operation. But on top of that, and the National Crime Agency from the United Kingdom led, they provided the key leadership for this. On top of that, there was a lot more effort to really sow distrust and discord amongst the Lockbit affiliate members. And so that was putting up splash pages that talked about how we knew who they were, how there was more action to come, and really to show the rest of the cybercrime ecosystem that police were on top of this, and that they weren't able to hide anymore. So there were subsequent Kronos operations in the spring, and even one recently. Lockbit didn't completely go away. They were really degraded, but overall, we continue. Now we have all the data behind the scenes to really look at who was behind it, and then really follow up on it. So another great example of 10 countries working together, taking a very multifaceted approach to going after Lockbit, and then supporting victims with things like decryption keys and what have you.
So that's maybe a good segue. I mean, we usually think about policing as going after bad guys and arresting them, but we've seen, similar to what you just said, but also in places like Australia that publicly doxed cyber criminals and levied financial sanctions. So I remember notably earlier this year in January, I think it was Australia, US, and UK combined sanctioned a gentleman by the name of Alexander Ermakov, a Russian accused of hacking Australian healthcare firm Medibank, stealing somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million Australian patient records, and then selectively disclosing certain sensitive health records, including those tied to things like abortions, HIV status, and alcohol abuse. Could we expect Canada to take a similar approach to rather than try to arrest somebody, actually go and kind of make them a public enemy, so to speak?
Canada doesn't have a specific cyber sanction regime. So we're right now under current legislation, we're not going to be able to impose cyber sanctions on individuals similar to what the UK and the Australia and the US did. But what I would say, Ian, is increasingly law enforcement, we're globally, and then their key allies, we are looking at all the tools in the toolbox to figure out how to go after and impose costs on cybercriminals. So one of those is cyber sanctions, and that sort of doxing or publicly announcing this person has been sanctioned. Law enforcement for a long time has used different Interpol notices, which can often mean someone might be picked up for arrest if they travel to a certain country or what have you. So increasingly the community is coming together and say, hey, who has the best tool to impose some kind of action on an individual or a group? And then even further, who has the sort of best athlete approach who can create the most impact? And then, so maybe they're designated to take on a certain lead role or action. And then the rest of the community figures out, okay, what their role is, right? And so that could include, okay, if there's infrastructure here in Canada, well, we'll go and get judicial authorization. Our police partners will go and get that judicial authorization to go after and seize that, or crypto accounts. And so the community has really matured to a point where we're having these conversations about who can do what and who's best place. And and Canada's in the thick of that. I think there's scope for us to do more, but we're definitely part of that multinational effort to impose costs on these cyber criminals.
Yeah, Lockbit was an interesting example. I think the other one that I was looking at was the Genesis darknet marketplace. I seem to recall somewhere around 17 countries involved, 119 arrests. Canada played a part of that. I guess when you're thinking about these broader initiatives where we are working hand in hand with other nations, what are the specific strengths that Canada has specifically, and how do we stack up against our peers?
Yeah, I mean, I think we stack up well. I think we need more capacity in cybercrime. Like I think when we are part of operations like Cookie Monster, where of the 17 nations, was sort of on that day of action in April 2023, Canada had the biggest effort. So here in Canada, the NC3, that was our role. We coordinated 28 different domestic police services along with the CRTC. And we went after over 70 suspected cyber criminals who were part of the Genesis marketplace or users of the Genesis marketplace. And so our strengths are really we can tap into that domestic law enforcement scene or capacity to create an impact. And in addition, it wasn't just the traditional put handcuffs. So there were arrests. There were 9 arrests linked to that. There were 9 search warrants. And then what we did was there was over 60 other individuals where maybe they weren't the highest end user of Genesis, but what we wanted to make sure is going to that sort of sow some discord amongst the community, and as well from that maybe prevent people from becoming hardened cyber criminals. We had police services across the country go and knock on the door of these individuals and ask them some questions about, hey, well, like voluntarily, like what were you doing on this site? You know, if you didn't know it was really bad, you should know, and you should get out of this business. So we not only did that sort of create, you know, this broad national impact, it also, you know, some of these individuals went and started talking online after this to say, hey, you know, like the RCMP or police service just showed at my door. And it started to sow some of that discord amongst the community. And it also, as I mentioned earlier, we have to do more, particularly people who are just getting into this type of legal activity, to like convince them, like, you do not want to go down this path. Like it has real consequences. And so we think in Genesis, we're in Operation Cookie Monster against the Genesis marketplace. We think we're able to do some of that.
So when you're responding to a cyber incident, let's say hypothetically a food distributor gets taken offline due to a cyber attack, how do you think about attribution? And I'm wondering specifically, does it change your response if you believe that it's a financially motivated crime group, aka, you know, a ransomware organization, versus maybe a nation state who you think might be involved?
I would say at the outset of an incident, it doesn't really change. It's really about collecting some of that initial information about the indicators of compromise, like what, you know, sort of classic traditional police work of like what happened, you know, what was impacted, you know, and some of those clues, such as indicators of compromise or ransom notes if it was a ransomware, and you know that sort of kicks off regardless. There is, I would say, a reassessment if there's sort of indications like there might be a state actor behind this, and then that might determine what police service in Canada would be involved. So, you know, for example, there's 5 cybercrime investigative teams within the RCMP, and if it was an attack against a government department or a certain type of maybe critical infrastructure, it'd be more likely that one of those teams would be the lead investigating agencies. So you might see where maybe it got reported locally to a police jurisdiction, you know, that comes to us, that information to the NC3, and then, you know, we figure out, hey, who might be best placed to follow up on that. So you know, that does enter into the assessment, and then, you know, at the same time we're liaising with our other federal government departments who are in this space to say, okay, like what information do we know, and that can sort of then chart the path of whether it's a state actor or you know, a financially motivated group. And you know, just to say, like, another challenge is now we are seeing this blend where you could have a state actor somehow involved, but also a financially motivated group as an affiliate. I read an article about Salt Typhoon, you know, a state-based APT, but also using commercially sort of cybercrime as a services applications to help them do their work. So the sort of ecosystem is even more complex. It's not just state, or it's not just, you know, a cybercrime that's financially motivated anymore. It could be a blend of both.
Yeah, I mean, there's also been, I think, considerable innovation in the last few years when it comes to technology. I'm thinking about things specifically like machine learning, AI, generative AI, potentially quantum coming on the scenes in the next couple of years. What's your perspective here around innovation? Has it been ultimately a boon for the good guys, the bad guys? Where is that technology innovation helped the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't think it's 100% either way. I think we have the potential in law enforcement to really leverage generative AI and other types of artificial intelligence to help us do our work, particularly in cyber. But we know for a fact the bad guys are adopting this technology as well. And that we know now a lot of the LLMs are like open, and so anybody can download them and create them, you know, tweak them for themselves. We hear things about worm GPT or fraud GPT. So, you know, one of the challenges from the law enforcement perspective, and particularly for the RCMP, is when we adopt a new technology or want to adopt a new technology, we got to go through a rigorous process to make sure it's legally compliant, sort of ethically we are using it properly. And there's a lot of concerns, as you probably know, about AI, that we're not going to use it in a way that like creates an unfair bias and what have you. So we have to do a lot of upfront stuff before, you know, using that technology. The bad guys don't do that, right? Like they just find something, and particularly if it's open source, they grab it. And then what we're seeing is, you know, they're using it, and I don't think they've fully leveraged it yet. You know, they're doing things like being able to do more phishing, mass phishing, you know, helping with social engineering type attacks, deep fake. We see a lot of that more on sort of some of the scams and fraud. But unfortunately, I don't think they've fully realized how to leverage it completely. So we're gonna have to up our game as well, because I think they're gonna know that this can help them, you know, and it can help us as well.
Yeah, there's no compliance departments at the ransomware
No,
group.
they don't have their trust and safety folks either.
It's been interesting. I've noticed a significant increase in quality in the amount of spam and phishing that I get ever since ChatGPT came out, and similarly when I talk to business owners and folks in the private sector, they realize, yeah, you know what, like it's not as easy to tell a phishing email apart anymore, because everybody's English got really good. So switching gears a little bit, so our focus is primarily protecting critical infrastructure in North America and allied nations. So I'd love your perspective on this. What would you like to see private sector organizations do to strengthen their cyber resilience in the face of cyber threats?
I got some great thoughts. I would say maybe they're not the most advanced thing. I would say even some of the basics. I still think even in the critical infrastructure side of house, like the basics of multi-factor, you know, backups. And when I go to the base, I talk about having like a good cyber incident response plan. I know most of them have it, but exercising it, right? Like I think we've moved away from where we can have a plan on the shelf where you should be exercising with the right people regularly. And from a law enforcement perspective, going back to when I talked about like we used to have a situation where victims wouldn't take our call. Have a part of your incident response plan that says, hey, like, how are we going to engage law enforcement? Or like, if law enforcement engages us, what is that going to look like? So I think I call those the basics. I still think there's a lot of work to do in that space. The other things I would say is are probably more related to culture. So I think there's still a way to go to move to a culture of security, particularly in some of the critical infrastructure sectors that didn't sort of have that sort of security mindset, or they didn't come from that world. You know, you mentioned kind of the food sector. You wouldn't normally say, hey, that's a security oriented CI sector. But what I would say, they have to, given the threats they're facing, they have to adopt that mindset. And so, rather than trying to get the cheapest or the quickest new technology that is connected to the internet, like their mindset's got to be like, okay, we got to make sure we've done our due diligence here and with our third-party suppliers before we sign up to that. So I think there's a lot of work to do in that sort of culture space that, everyone's got to own it. All the executives got to own it. They got to exercise, as I talked about. And I think that will change sort of their level of preparedness and resilience.
Yeah, it's interesting. We see a lot, particularly with the non-obvious critical infrastructure industries, like food I give as a good example, because I don't typically see food distributors listed on any official list of either sectors or specific companies that are within the critical infrastructure segment. I mean, a lot of times I'll see a list of power companies or a list of healthcare organizations, financial institutions. These are pretty obvious, but I think also the culture within those organizations either was security oriented or safety oriented. You think about power companies, very, very strong safety culture. You start to get into some more IP rich companies that are more, maybe trace their lineage back to academia, where there's a culture of openness, of sharing, of trying new things, and there's not as much of a focus around risk. And you end up in a situation where it's a lot harder to have, even to your point, those basic conversations like, hey, we got to keep things patched. Hey, we got to minimize access. We have to enforce things around least privilege, around maybe not everybody in the company has access to all the data all the time for any reason. How do you kind of pull things back? Are you finding, so your comment around kind of sticking to the basics is interesting. When you're going out and you're engaging with a private sector organization during or after an incident, have you noticed any trends around either the sophistication or the lack of sophistication from a cybersecurity perspective? And really what I'm trying to get at is, are you typically responding more to companies who are just unprepared and they haven't put the basics in place, or are you still seeing companies that have invested a lot, they've done their training, they've exercised their incident response teams, and they're still getting breached?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we're seeing both. I think, I'd say some of the sort of small, medium enterprises and organizations that maybe haven't had the resource to invest, I think we see where, okay, there could have been more to data backups, what have you. But at the same time, we've seen organizations that invest the most, probably they could and still get attacked. I would say, one of the big challenges, and I'm sure you're alive to this, Ian, is just the third-party supplier piece of this, right? Like, you could do so much to defend your own networks and have the best plans and exercises, and you rely on some external service. And even when you do your due diligence there, so it's the nature of how our economy and organizations work nowadays, is we're so interconnected. But I think when I go back to that culture of security concept, you need to realize, the organizations realize, like, the bubble that we're trying to protect is not just our organization. It's almost everybody we touch or who touches us, which is, really hard to do. But conceptually, organizations really need to think about that.
Well, and just in the last couple of weeks, we saw a presentation from a security researcher who discovered that a company was attacked by their neighbors' wireless networks. That the company's networks were actually pretty secure, and so the bad guys were able to hack literally a neighbor from across the street, jump from that access point to the company's access point, and get in that way. So definitely a lot of creativity and innovation. Chris, I'm almost afraid to ask this question. What keeps you up at night?
Yeah, a bunch of stuff. I would say I made that earlier comment. I think we're just at the onset of cyber criminals figuring out how to use Gen AI to create perfect, air quotes, phishing, social engineering attacks that, technically it's not going to get picked up, and even the human is not. They're going to be able to mine so much of the data that has been already stolen out there to create the perfect email or message that shows up in my or your inbox, that we have no reason not to click on it. And so I worry about that. Now I'm hoping maybe on our side AI will catch up, and or we can use to say, hey, to detect that better. But I worry about that. I also think a lot about, you talk about the food sector, but I do think there's a lot more scope in the healthcare sector to protect there. Anybody who has ever had, been in the hospital, had a kid that needed urgent medical attention, it is the worst usually day of your life. And I really think that there's more to do in that space, so that we don't have hospitals that get attacked and shut down because of ransomware and have you. So where right now we've had sort of one-offs, but if we had sort of multiple at the same time, I think the results could be pretty impactful. But I'll take the opportunity to say, though, I do, what keeps me up at night, there's some bad things, but I also have a lot of hope, Ian. I've never seen the level of collaboration or passion from a whole bunch of different parts of our society who want to come and tackle this problem. So, this sort of team sport that you have law enforcement, you got other government departments, you got the private sector that are really passionate and driven to say, like, we don't want this happening to our country and our citizens. And from a law enforcement perspective, traditionally law enforcement doesn't work with the private sector to try and figure out how to address problems or crimes. But we've really had a mindset change, and we got some ways to go, but saying, like, we have no choice to work with a whole bunch of different sectors to go after these individuals who are attacking our hospitals and impacting our economy. And so there's a lot of energy and motivation. We've got to figure out ways. It's the classic share information, but maybe take a little bit more risks in some area where we can, and tap into that passion to figure out how we can reduce the impact of cybercrime on Canadians.
I appreciate that. Chris, any final thoughts?
No, just appreciate the opportunity, Ian. As I mentioned, law enforcement, we've really evolved. We've got a long way to go in terms of addressing cybercrime. But I think we've got an approach working with our partners in law enforcement and working with the private sector and others that we can make a real impact. But there's some busy days ahead.
Chris, thank you so much for joining today and sharing your story. I think the work that you and NC3 are doing, crucial for Canada as well as the broader defense of democratic institutions. Appreciate your time and insights. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian.